Now, of course, this doesn't mean that ethnic fractionalization doesn't indirectly affect conflict. Okay? So, for example, it could affect it via lowering the amount of GDP, and this is the work done by Alberto Alessina on this subject. Okay? Once you correct for GDP, it has no direct effect, but it might work through the GDP channel, right? Or it might work through reduced GDP growth. Okay? So, Bill Easterly at work on this. Or it might work via poor governance, okay, by greater corruption. But the claim is that there's no direct effect. And yet, so I want, really the first one-third of my talk is really I want to ask, is fractionalization really the right measure of what we want trying to capture? Okay? So for this, let's go back to my little Bible, Horowitz again. Okay, let's read a passage from Horowitz. So Horowitz says, in dispersed systems, group loyalties are parochial and ethnic conflict is localized. A centrally focused system with fewer groupings possesses fewer cleavages than a dispersed system, but those it does possess runs through the whole society and are of greater magnitude. Now this is, by the way, written before people have actually used measures of ethnic diversity. Okay? But if they had read this carefully, they may not have used it. Okay? Nevertheless, this is written before, saying that if you look at a society with a lot of diverse ethnicities, what Horowitz is trying to argue here is such societies may actually not be very conflictual, because conflict may be very localized in those societies. It's only when there are big ethnic cleavages running through that society that you might have a sense of conflict. And this actually echoes an older Marxian theme, right? As the struggle proceeds, the whole society breaks up more and more into two hostile camps, right? In that case, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The classes polarize so that they become internally more homogeneous and more sharply distinguished from one another in birth and power. So this is more a notion of polarization rather than fragmentation. Fragmentation gives the sense of there being lots of pieces, right? And polarization gives the sense of there being some pieces, but big ones, right? So, and that's the idea that I want to try and capture. So I want to tell you a little bit about some work that I've done in this area many years ago, so this is from 1994, okay? But I'm going to try and weave it into this lecture. And Joan Esteban, my colleague in Barcelona, and I have worked on this idea of the identity alienation framework, a way of thinking about polarization. So let me tell you how that works, and we'll come back to the empirical issue in a second. So let's think of society as being divided into different groups, okay? So economic, social, religious, whatever. And we want to capture the idea that a society is polarized when within any group there is a large amount of identity or homogeneity. And across groups, there's a large amount of alienation or antagonism. Okay? So it's a combination of both equality within the group and inequality across groups. Okay? So that's the idea that we want to try and get. And the axiomatic approach that I'm going to talk about, it presumes, okay, it doesn't prove, it assumes that such a situation is conflictual. Now, is it conflictual? We don't know. Okay, but let's try it out. Right? So this is the first time I get to quote from myself. So I thought that word, but I want to put it up because it's relevant here. So we begin with the obvious question: why are we interested in polarization? Well, it is our contention that the phenomenon of polarization is closely linked to the generation of tensions, to the possibilities of articulated rebellion and revolt, and to the existence of social unrest in general. Now, at that time, we didn't know anything about the fractionalization indices. We only learned about it later, right? But this is going to generate a very different kind of index, and I want to try and introduce that. Okay, so let me first try to argue that the standard theory of inequality measurement does not fit this notion of polarization, that it is entirely a different concept. So to show you that, I'm going to just tell you one line about standard theories of inequality measurement, which is the idea of the transfers principle, which is due to Pigo and Dalton, which says that if in any society I take a transfer of resources from relatively poor people and give it to relatively rich people, inequality should go up. And if I do it the other way, transfer from relatively rich to relatively poor, inequality should come down. Okay, this is called the transfer. And all the inequality measures that we know, the Gini coefficient, the coefficient of variation, all of these are based on the Dalton transfer principle. Now, let me show you an example. So this is an income distribution, an imaginary income distribution. Okay? And I'm going to take this imaginary distribution and compress it around two poles. Okay? So now I have two groups forming here. Okay? So these groups are more like each other, this group over here, and that group is internally more like each other, and they each see a common enemy, which is the other group. We would like to argue that in this society, going from the black line to the blue line, polarization is actually going up. But if you look at the Dalton principle, the transfers principle, is going exactly in the opposite direction. Because in this case, all you're doing is making income transfers from relatively rich people to relatively poor people. From here to here, and from there to there. Okay? And therefore, every inequality measure that economists use is going to come down when you move to the black line to the blue line. Yet, there is some sense in which this society is getting more polarized. We would like to be able to say that this society is actually becoming possibly more antagonistic. But inequality is going to come down. And this is going to come back to the idea of why fractionalization is insignificant in the empirics. Okay? I'm going to go back to that idea. Yes?
So wouldn't you want the blue line to start from the black line on the left?
No, they're two density functions. They just integrate up to total population.
Oh, you're decreasing the number of the poorest there.
Yeah, the poorest, exactly. These are density functions. By the way, feel free to ask me anything you like. We don't have to wait till the end. Okay. Okay, so now this is not to argue that the concept I'm proposing is always different from inequality. Okay, so for example, here's another density, and I just compress it globally. Okay, then inequality comes down, and polarization comes down. So in other words, I'm not trying to say that this idea is always different from inequality. It's just that it's orthogonal to inequality. Sometimes it's the same, sometimes it's different. So this is what we first try to axiomatize. So let me give you a little flavor of that, and then I will move on. Okay? So the way economists think about axiomatizing measures like this is you think of inputs and outputs. So an input here is a density function, the distribution of income, if you like. Right? And an output is a number. It's a measure of how polarized that distribution function is. Okay? So just a mechanical object on which we want to place certain assumptions and then see where the assumptions take us. So the objective is axiomatically to try and pin down a class of measures. So going back to the identification alienation framework, remember that each person feels identification with people of similar income, alienation from people with similar income, and the basic idea of these measures is that an individual's effective sense of antagonism, not just, so you can think of a society in which an individual is completely isolated, buys a machine gun, and kills a lot of other people. Okay? Now, that is of course also violence, right? But it is not the kind of organized social violence that we have in mind. Okay? So for that sort of violence, we want to capture the idea that the effective antagonism of a person, X towards Y, depends not only on my alienation from you, of course that's necessary, okay? But also on the number of other people I can feel who are also victims like me, right? Or perceived victims, right? So it has to depend both on my sense of alienation and also on my sense of identification. Okay? That is what we think of as effective antagonism, right? It's not that I'm isolated in this. So I want to think of polarization as the sum of all such antagonisms over the population. Now, this is not very useful in the stats. I've written it down there, right? So you're thinking it's not very useful, and I'm thinking it's not very useful, okay? So I've written that down. But hopefully it's a good starting point to think about this question. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to write down axioms for you which I want my measure of polarization to satisfy, and then we want to see what measure it gives us. Okay? So they're based on very special distributions which we call basic densities, which are just sort of symmetric single peak distributions on a bounded range. And here are the axioms. So let me talk very quickly about the axioms. So the first axiom says that if a distribution is just a single basic density like this, and I compress it like that, okay? Mathematically I can write all that down, but this is the equivalent, then polarization should go up. So that's the first assumption. The second assumption says that if my distribution looks a three-peaked distribution in society, okay, notice these distributions may be very hard to find. That doesn't mean that my assumption is stronger, it means that my assumption is weaker, because I'm imposing it on a very small subset of cases. Right? But if my distribution looks like that, and I take the two side distributions and I compress them so that I have two articulated groups on either side, then polarization should go up. And that's my second assumption. My third assumption is that if I have four groups, okay, in society, shaped in this particular way, I take the two middle groups and pull them away to the side so that I separate people away from the middle. Polarization should go up. And the fourth axiom says that if I take all the population in society and scale it up, okay, keeping all the distribution unchanged, I just scale the population up or down, then the ranking of polarization should remain unchanged. So this is neutrality. And the theorem is that the polarization measure satisfies these axioms if and only if, okay, it looks like that particular formula. Okay, there's no other formula which satisfies those four axioms that I wrote down for you. Okay? So what is this formula? This formula says, so x and y are income categories. Okay? And an n of x and n of y are the percentages of people in each income category. Okay? So n of x, for example, is a number like 10%. 10% of the population earn income x. N of y is another number, 15%. They earn income y. Right? So it says that what you do is you take a particular x and y pair, raise n of x to the power, to a particular power, and that power has to lie between I think it would be like, sorry? The bomb went off? Is that still working? The camera's good. Let me just